have our first live session with our ThoughtWorks transformation principals, Luke Vinogradov and Kathy Gettelfinger, who I'm just about to introduce you to. Luke has a 20-year career, which includes launching pioneering mobile products for Amazon. He's created offerings with startups and built new in-house digital capability as a senior leader within organizations such as Tesco and McDonald's. He now leads digital transformation here with us at ThoughtWorks in the UK. And Luke is joined by Kathy Gettelfinger, live from Minneapolis. It's around 6 a.m. her time, so thank you again, Kathy. Kathy has 20 years experience working in the world of IT and software development and provides strong expertise in what it takes to bring strategy to execution. She's worked with clients to bridge technology, product and people gaps, again, across multiple industries. So I know we've got plenty of valuable information to learn from them today. I'm now going to hand over to them both, but I'll be on the Q&A function should you need me, and I will see you in about 25 minutes time. Thank you, Luke and Kathy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amy, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, wherever you are. Good to be here with you. We're going to talk a little bit about resilience and building that into your business. Now, I had struggled, if I'm honest, a little bit with the idea of resilience, with the word resilience, which tends to have these connotations of hunkering down, you know, while the blows rain down upon you and emerging stronger, but essentially not that different afterwards. Personally, yes. Organizationally, kind of view that a little bit differently, perhaps. And so rather than kind of battening down the hatches and keeping the change out there, actually, we think that running towards that change and embracing that may be a better approach. And hence the idea coming up of bending rather than breaking. So bending when your customers are pulling you towards offerings that you don't have, away from the ones you are comfortable with, or bending when the shape of your organization is not helping you to get things done, or when the data tells you your strategy that you loved so much is actually wrong, or fundamentally bending when the capabilities that just a few short years ago you regarded as exhaustive of your core capabilities now barely touch the size of what's required for you to compete in a digitally charged environment. So over the last 25 years or so, we've worked with so many different organizations and learned a lot about why some organizations are dealing with this kind of change better than others. We call these modern digital businesses. Kathy.
Right. Yes, and modern digital businesses are just designed to handle change. They're optimized, if you will, for change. And they have certain mindset and capabilities that allow them to thrive in this kind of environment. And one of the most important things, of course, is that they use a customer focus. They relentlessly focus on what's of value to their customers. And we have kind of called out 7 key characteristics that these modern digital businesses have that I think will be interesting to think about from your perspective and your organization. What of these key characteristics you think your organization holds, or maybe which provide some sort of a challenge for you. And so the first one, Luke, customer value focus.
Customer value focus. This one, in many ways, is the easiest one and the hardest one to explain. Easiest because the words make perfect sense. And in fact, they're used in pretty much every organization around the globe, pretty much every day, because nobody gets up in the morning, comes into work or into the study in the present case, and thinks they're going to do a bad job for customers. Nobody's going to do that. But internalizing the real truth of customer centricity is a whole lot harder. It is subject to a lot of debate as well. So a lot of organizations actually talk a lot about the customer, but in fact their focus is on themselves, or sometimes on some abstraction that's neither the customer nor themselves, like the idea of running a great operation, which is a perfectly rational thing, but is subtly and importantly different from running an operation which truly delivers on the most important customer needs. So sometimes the difference is actually about priority or sequencing, but it's also, I think, about finding the customer everywhere in your business. So I worked with a retail client a little while back who was super focused on the customer. They had the personas, cardboard cutouts all around the office. They knew their name. They knew where they went to school. They went, what clubs they went to. They knew them. They felt they knew these personas intimately, but they were so focused on what they saw as the customer domain that they entirely missed the connection between that customer's experience and the broken warehouse and logistics back-end systems that they used that were driving repeated failure to deliver, because the customer wasn't everywhere. The customer was just over here in one spot. And that doesn't always work so very well. And I think if you look at folks like Blockbuster, that debate has raged endlessly as well about whether Blockbuster was killed by Netflix or lack of customer centricity, or, as I read recently, technology and convenience as opposed to customer centricity. Of course, customer centricity drove a series of investments in technology and convenience, which ultimately won the customer. So, you know, we can draw some conclusions from that.
And the next couple of characteristics are also very important. Outcome aligned organization. And I think what's key here is still tying back to the customer. A lot of organizations align around their mission and values, and these are really important. But if you just align around mission and values, what you kind of end up with is a lot of really well-intentioned hard work. Sometimes at cross purposes with each other in the organization. And often you don't find out that that hard work led to the wrong thing or to nothing until it was too late. So what does it mean to be outcome aligned? When we say outcomes, we mean customer value focused outcomes. This means focusing on something that is going to be of value to the customer that they want. So one example that we like to use is getting customers into homes. And a bank might be focused on selling mortgages to customers, but no customer actually really wants a mortgage, but they do want to be in a home. So being focused on selling, not selling mortgages, but actually getting customers into homes is one example of a customer focused outcome. And if you have very specific outcomes like this identified that everyone can rally their work around, you're not going to have people working at cross purposes, and you'll actually be able to move the dial on some of the indicators that you're pushing. Which leads me to what kind of indicators do you want to be looking at? And that would be preferably leading indicators. If you're just looking at your revenue, you're not going to know for quite a while whether or not what you're doing is working. So you need to identify those really crisp leading indicators that the work that you're doing is actually having the intended outcome. And that's what allows that responsiveness to market shifts, because then you can, kill off the work that isn't actually serving you and your customers and actually spin up new work to identify and put your funding toward, so that you can be more responsive to changes in the marketplace, changes in your customers' needs.
Okay, so a test and learn culture, so weaving that experimental mindset throughout all the aspects of your organization. Modern digital businesses know that understanding a customer's needs and finding solutions to those needs is a fairly complex and imprecise science, and some might say art as well. And I guess with that acknowledgement that they don't have absolute certainty, instead what they do is focus on forming hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, validating their assumptions before they go into investment mode and scaling mode, rather than going straight, as some organizations do, from focus groups to dropping 10 million and the inevitable disappointment that finds that the two things actually don't line up. And so for many of them, this really goes beyond words into the kind of experimentation lifestyle, if you like, that's so important inside the organization. And that can be as micro as A/B testing in their experience design or in customer comms, but can also and should also be as macro as corporate strategy. So in between those two, for example, we worked with a publishing client recently to create a lean product development toolkit. They were moving into creating services in areas that were very different to their normal content-led products. And so they ran the risk of over-investing in things because they looked good, because it was unfamiliar territory. So we equipped them with a bunch of methodologies to be able to model and validate their ideas prior to actually scaling them. So there was a whole new discipline for the company. Now, if you're really going to adopt this experimental mindset, those organizations that do that are going to start viewing their data differently. They're going to view it as strategic assets, not as some kind of random byproduct that hopefully you have. And the capabilities associated with that, they're going to prioritize very highly as well, because if you believe that data can make your decisions better, you're going to work hard to get that data into the hands and indeed into the minds of individuals who can use that to improve the decisions they make every day. But of course, mindset is still as important as tool set. So we recently shaped a data-focused transformation for a client who wanted to try to marry the technological and behavioral change required to unlock the value of their data. Their previous attempts hadn't delivered to the extent that they'd wanted to, hadn't gained momentum, because they focused more on tools and business value was running a second, and then a distant third was the human change elements required. And so they just didn't have that impact. So modern digital businesses understand that, and they also can not just optimize on customer visible things, but on their structures, on their governance, enabling them to move faster, enabling them to take friction out of the work. And often that is actually by pushing decision-making down in the organization, closer to the work, closer to those individuals who have a better insight about how to solve those problems.
Yeah. And of course, the seventh characteristic is technology at the core. Oftentimes, technology is viewed as a cost center. In the past, we've definitely seen that it's an afterthought. It can't be an afterthought in a modern digital business because, you know, to Luke's point around data, you have to have a data strategy that is integral to your overall strategy. But that's true for your platform strategy and how you use technology. Otherwise, you could end up wasting quite a bit of money on technology and not having it actually fit for the needs that you have, which of course will mean you don't have the money to spend on the more important things that you need to do. So how do you get these mindsets? Well, actually, before I do that, we want to ask you a question about these.
Yeah, we want to hear from you.
We are curious. We're going to put up a poll here now. Which of these characteristics provide your organization the most challenge? You know, and maybe it's which of these characteristics, if you're not doing any of them, do you think will be the most difficult for your organization to try to adopt? We were kind of going back and forth about what we thought might be the most challenging for people. But we'd love to hear from you. If you could just go ahead and say which of these characteristics is the most challenging for you.
This is one of the, when we interact with clients around these kinds of issues, this is one of the areas I find the most fascinating, because sometimes it's those things that are concepts that are just hard for individuals to get. So we'll often talk to someone who's sort of very enlightened in an organization, who's frustrated because they're saying their peers, they don't get it. And sometimes that's because they just don't get the concepts. In other cases, actually, it's almost the opposite. A little bit like I mentioned with customer centricity, in the sense that they get the words and all the words are really, really familiar, but it actually represents something dramatically different to what they think it is. Customer centricity is one, and another particular favorite, I don't know about you, Kathy, is data-driven. And so people say, oh yeah, we've got an analytics department. We're all over that thing. And then when you find out the analytics department is doing paper reports about what happened a year ago, rather than algorithms about what we think might happen a year from now, it's quite hard to explain the galactic difference between those two states.
Well, I find with data-driven, actually, one of the most interesting things I see is that people say, yeah, we have data that proves this sort of theory that we have. But when you dig into the data they're using, it's fairly qualitative, which can be okay, because sometimes that's the only data you have. But I think we tend to seek out data that validates the ideas that we have. So
I would never do that.
I see that a lot. Yeah. So when we push people on truly being data driven, that is where the proof comes in.
Okay, results are in. What have we got? Look at that. 20 second from the top is, or equal second is data, as we were talking about. I suppose that's about dealing with the new, but then look at that, 23 and 20 around the shape of the organization and the way that actually you align that and measure that and keep that honest to the customer vision that you have. Interesting, because that's often where there's a lot of legacy. And I think sometimes organizational and process legacy is even harder and more insidious than technological legacy, which at least everybody can point at because it's a thing on a box somewhere, as opposed to culture and as opposed to process, which is maybe a little harder to address.
Yeah, I think what's interesting there, having done a lot of software development, obviously Agile became a thing quite some time ago, too long to remember now. And we've been doing Agile software delivery for a long time at ThoughtWorks. And I think one of the reasons I was excited to get into transformation more as a whole organizationally is because you go into an engineering group or an IT department and try to transform that department or group. You can only get so far until you start bumping up against those structures that will literally prevent you and actively try to destroy what you're doing in terms of transformation, because the organization is calcified around gateways and structures that prevent work from happening, as opposed to structures that help make good work happen and kill off work that's not working.
Indeed. And actually, Kathy, just connecting that, Alex Richards has just posted a question on the Q&A talking about experts and established expertise. That connects very much to what you're saying, is that the things that we think we know how to do are actually as immovable a legacy as the structures we have, the processes we have, and the systems that we have. And in fact, Prashant Gandhi and I wrote an article a little while ago about these concepts in the financial services domain, and talking about the difference between kind of component level knowledge and architectural knowledge. And so when a new thing comes along, sometimes we mistakenly think it's a component and we go to plug it in because we're the experts in this machine. So we know exactly where to put that thing. And quite often what we've missed is the fact that it's a whole new machine. And as a result, that expertise, what you want is to be enabled by your expertise up to the point where it starts to constrain you, and that's where you want to stop. But it's a difficult thing, both at largely at a human level, because there is comfort in expertise. There is actually value, assuming that you play it right. There's value in that expertise, but it's a fine balance, as I say, between enablement and then constraint.
Yeah,
okay.
I think what's interesting, one second, what's interesting in Alex's question, I just wanted to point out that it's very, very common, kind of what I was saying before about finding data that validates our own thinking. This is sort of a similar thing, except maybe I think what I've seen is actually a little more insidious than an expert saying, I know this to be true. And that's actually just not even bothering to actually prove the value or validating the work that you've done. And one of the ways you can get around this issue, people just sort of falling in love with their own idea, is changing some of those organizational structures that require identifying how are you going to measure this piece of work and that it actually achieved what you thought it would. That's when you have to force that. What will measure this? What will prove this? If you can actually force that, then people have to start to really look at actual data for whether or not their idea is valid.
I think there's appetite, before we move on. I think there's appetite for that. If you look at the cottage industry in Amazon-based, little bites of culture that circulate on LinkedIn and other places around this. And as an ex-Amazonian, I'm very familiar with the whole sit down for 5-10 minutes with a group in silence, read the doc, because actually it is full of those measures that are going to determine whether what you're saying has value or not, rather than actually whether you can tell a nice story. It's hard to break that in organizations, but obviously based on what we were just saying, some have managed to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just, there's one more question here posted. I'm just gonna go ahead and read it now because we actually like to focus on the questions versus what we planned to say. So cultural problems underlie a lot of the blockers to adopting modern digital ways of working. True, true. We sort of joke that it's almost never a technology problem. When top-down hierarchical approaches are taken, leadership can claim the organization is customer-centric, agile, data-driven, but the reality may be far from that. How do you tackle the fundamental issues when an organization falls into the pathological category on Westrom's organization types? This is clearly a leadership problem. Pathological leadership. Let's see, let's go to the heart of that question. Let's see, how do you, it's a long question, so how do you tackle the fundamental issues? Well, making any transformation requires something up from the top, from leadership, but it also requires sort of a groundswell of change. And so I don't know, I think if you're in the pathological category, that is going to be pretty significantly difficult. So it's hard to answer without any real detail of the specific problem. But clearly, if you don't have your leadership understanding that there is a problem or that something needs to shift, it's going to be pretty difficult to kind of convince them that something needs to change if they've sort of justified how they're working.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of what the solution looks like, and then there's how you bring the solution about, which I think are a little bit different. In terms of the solution, empowerment is obviously part of that. Transparency is a big part of that. But one of the things I found in organizations that have suffered from this top-down push, the most effective thing that we've been able to do in those circumstances is to equip people in the teams, not just to complain about that, or not just to observe, you know, how negative it is, because we see that it's negative, but quite often the leaders are pushing some of this down because they think that's their job. And no one's released them from telling other people how to do stuff. No one's said, hey, do you know what? I'm okay with the how, but you tell me, and probably with the what, but you tell me the why. And so here's what that looks like. So putting in place, for example, proxy measures. I've run teams myself before where we were not tasked with anything sensible as a metric. So what I did is I got our team bringing forward metrics that were sensible, that could actually equate to customer value. And we lived and died within our team on those. And then we played those back, and that actually helped to try to bring about that cultural change. But it's a slow and often painful process, to be sure.
Yeah, that's a good way to go about it, though, because you're demonstrating a behavior that you'd like the rest of the organization to take up.
It's the most powerful thing that you can do, because otherwise, the worst case is it's a repeated request to somebody else to do better. Hey, do better, you know, stay out of my business. Like, if you're actually in an executive role where empowerment is coming about in your organization, it is unclear to you how that's going to impact what you're doing and what the new shape of your role is. And actually, it's often underestimated just how important it is to spell that out and to help those individuals to do that. Otherwise, in the absence of that, they'll do something perfectly rational, which is to dream up a plan and say, let's go over here. Not an irrational thing to do, not an effective thing to do necessarily, but certainly not crazy.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about how would you build some of these characteristics so that could lead into it, because of course there has to be a way to get these characteristics. Otherwise, we'll make everyone very sad with our conversation about these great modern digital businesses that you'll never be like.
Yeah, interesting. We debated, Kathy and I, about because the rubber hits the road with capability, right? So it's not just about what you think, it's also about clearly what you do. But we debated about which is the chicken and which is the egg in this scenario. And there's a guy called John Shook has a model. He talks about of change, talking about going via behavior in order to change culture. And it's harder to see which is chicken and which is egg in these cases, because I think we've all seen organizations that have tried to build capability in things, but ultimately the prevailing culture didn't value the things they're building capability in. And you know, I'm trying not to say data lake. Oh, I said it. But look, how many times have we seen data lakes out there that just sit sad, lonely, and neglected and very expensive, because ultimately the hunger and the curiosity and the process and the motivation wasn't there for individuals to utilize that, because they haven't necessarily thought about how mindset actually is going to drive behavior. So it's a complex relationship.
Yeah. But we also want to call out that we've framed the lens of looking at the landscape of all the capabilities you could build, and there are many, 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 and framed that around these 5 building blocks of frictionless operating model, where some of that outcome aligned organization, how you fund things, all that lives, and the governance, all the way through platform strategy, the experience design and product centricity that you have, data-driven decision-making, and then engineering culture and mindset. This is just a way to look at all the landscape of capabilities that you could or should build. And I shouldn't even say should, because we actually think you need to look at, at what you're actually trying to achieve in order to determine what capabilities to build. But what's really important here, despite that we've put this into 5 neat blocks, it's not that neat. You can't just focus on one of these blocks and say, we're going to be the best engineering culture in the world. You will bump up against things in these other blocks. You have to kind of look across this whole landscape at what sorts of capabilities you need to build in order to achieve your desired outcomes.
I think that point, Kathy, is so fundamental, the interconnectedness of these things, which doesn't mean maxing out on everything, but it does mean having, at least at some point, at some level in the organization, a holistic view of this stuff. And if you think about actually, the amazing contributions of agile transformation in terms of development methodology over the last years, where it hasn't worked is less about it not working and more about it simply failing to deliver past a certain point. The challenge is, if you focus only on that and you supercharge your engineering culture to do that, that you run the risk at some point, not just diminishing returns, but sort of actively doing stupid things faster, if you haven't actually upgraded the rest of your organizational thinking in order to be able to mesh in with that and maximize value on a kind of end-to-end company or customer basis.
Yeah, somebody commented in the Q&A section about acknowledging the elephant. And it is an elephant, and I use that analogy a lot. I'd love to have a different one if someone has an alternate to the eating the elephant analogy. But I think what's also important here is you don't need to eat the whole elephant, right? And oops. So I think we can talk a little bit about how you decide how much of this landscape you need to consume.
Exactly. And I think what you're seeing there is the digital fluency model, which for us is our attempt to address these sort of big questions of saying, well, okay, great. I understand the digital mindset. I'm going to build a bunch of digital capabilities, but there is a world of complexity. There is a world of investment there taken collectively. It's huge. So, as a leader in an organization trying to make that change, what do you focus on? How do you make it manageable? How do you break down that elephant in order to consume it? And so for us, and the fluency model here really is, it's about you. So your aspirations, your customers, your strategy, your context, maybe just the organizational moment that you're in, as opposed to that whole, here's what awesome looks like, here's what the leaders are doing, you've got to do that too. And, I'm sorry to say that I've been involved, and as have we all probably, in programs that vaporized a lot of money very quickly, chasing not just unrealistic aspirations, but unnecessary aspirations to build capabilities that, frankly, if they'd arrived fully formed, our customers wouldn't have understood them coming from us in particular, a particular brand, because they weren't sensitive to our context. They were simply aping the leaders of the pack. So a mistake to be avoided there. And we think the digital fluency model is part of the way of doing that.
Yeah, there's a couple of good questions that I want to make sure we answer. There's one here: is your fluency model simply about optimization? How do you either allow or promote innovation? We have talked a good deal about optimization, but the reality is, why bother to optimize? And that is so that you can promote innovation. That is so that you can be flexible and responsive to market needs. Optimizing is about taking out some of those, that calcification in your organization, so that you can be more nimble and be more responsive, so that people can trust in the innovation too. I think a lot of companies spin up an innovation lab, but people are like, that's work over there that maybe it'll come up with something pretty, but we don't believe in that work. Whereas if you build this into your organization, build innovation and the way to operate into your organization that allows for innovation all over the place, you're actually going to be promoting more innovation. Quick thing on the fluency pattern, it's not realistic to try to do everything, right? And so that's where Luke was talking about focusing on what are your aspirations as an organization. How can you decide where to start with the elephant? Ear, tail, foot. I had one client who, when going through this model with the executive team, he said, why wouldn't we just go for strengthening in everything? I said, well, you don't have unlimited time or unlimited money, so we have to ruthlessly prioritize where you want to start. That would be amazing if you could be amazing at everything, but you probably don't need to waste your money. I liked what you said, Luke, about vaporize your money on some things that you just don't need to do.
I've stolen that one from Dave Robinson, our colleague, who's very experienced in this space, and talks about his previous experience in vaporizing millions, and how that led to a kind of awakening of actually how efficiently you vaporize millions is probably not a measure of how successful your organization is. Although, ironically, a lot of our measures in program offices and so forth tend to be actually geared around that. I've just noticed a couple of questions in the Q&A there. One is about, is this realistically possible for large organizations? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, and I'm tempted to quip, have you seen the staff numbers at Amazon lately? This is a vast organization. Now, obviously, they have acknowledged, Bezos has acknowledged, that there is always the risk of day one ending at some point with that organization. And I would have thought, indeed, scale would be one of the dimensions which makes that tough to sustain over time. But I think it's about where you focus it. And also this may address to some extent the question around how you include everyone in these outcomes. That we often have conversations about transformation with a leader in a corner of the organization. So we have a conversation that says, oh, we've got all these problems, all these things are really difficult, these are the outcomes we're trying to achieve but failing to achieve. You talk through some of these things and you say, okay, this problem here, who owns that? Are they in the room? This problem here, who owns that? Are they in the room? And after a while, you realize that actually you don't have most of the people in the room that you need to be in the room. Now that presents a challenge in order to try and get some sort of view across the organization, really motivate that. It means going up very high in the organization to achieve that, rather than this thing ending up a tail attempting to wag a dog. But it's where the payoff actually is. Now, that may mean the whole organization, but it may mean a division of the organization. Or if you can find a group within that organization where you can be relatively independent and all of your functions are represented. And so you can start to model what good structure and processes and approaches look like, but without this thing of saying, I have to change an enormous giant organization. So we often have conversations with individuals to say, whether it's a division or a product group or something in between, that's how you go about starting. And again, attempting to do this top down with a whole giant organization or even a mid-sized organization may not be the right approach.
Yeah, Luke, I just wanted to address one quick comment from Russ. The Agile fluency model is a copyright and not ThoughtWorks. Absolutely, and we actually spoke with when creating the digital fluency model, actually spoke with the folks who created the Agile fluency model to get approval to expand on what they'd done a little more broadly using the digital fluency. So I just wanted to address that comment. And there's one more question I think we have time to answer here. How does your model live harmoniously with corporate funding and reporting cycles? Yes, very challenging, because if things are funded annually, reporting cycles I think is less of a challenge, but when you fund things annually, it tends to actually cause you to vaporize money on things that just aren't going to achieve your outcomes. And I think one really good way of thinking that one of my colleagues shared with me, there's allocating and there's distributing money. So you could allocate funds on an annual basis, but actually distribute it in a different way. So that you're planning ahead, you're thinking about the year to come and allocating the money, but you don't actually distribute it until you've tested hypotheses and validated that something is worth scaling. So that's one way to kind of work through that sort of annual thinking or more longer term.
Yeah, quite often in organizations, what you find is, however granular a lot of the reportage is around what's going to happen for the money, actually individual leaders are bucketing and groups are bucketing. And we know that we've got a bucket of money over here and there's a name on it, and we're doing some stuff which is sort of aligned to what the name of the bucket is, but actually there's a sort of a shadow structure going on. And so that's actually a useful way to draw on that to get started with a different way of doing this, because what you can do is take a bucket that's been committed, and what you can do is sell back to the finance group the fact that not only will you not vaporize more money than was in there, but actually what you'll aim to do through progressive and iterative delivery is add more controllability to the quality of the outcomes and the value delivered by that. Whereas the normal process doesn't say, well, after a month, after 2 months, after 3 months, we're questioning the value we're seeing, so we're going to pull the plug. Usually, if you've got a year's worth of money, you're going to spend a year's worth of money, and it's only after you've spent it that you all conclude, well, that was a bad investment, because of the sunk cost fallacy and a bunch of other cultural factors.
So we just wanted to kind of wrap it by saying it's really important to think about where you aspire to be as a business. And actually you have to be pretty honest about your current state. That can be kind of hard. That's where we often come in for our clients to help keep them honest about and make observations about where they are versus where their aspirations are, and actually just helping them align on their aspirations, because that can be tricky. You can get 5 executives in a room and you will get 5 different answers on what what their aspirations might be. But you have to understand where you're trying to head and then be really clear and honest about where you're at to be able to really make a roadmap of how you're going to get there and where you're even going to get started.
Yeah. I think another question has landed in the Q&A. I think how are we doing for time? We're a few minutes left.
Time to answer that. Let's see. How do you balance customer value and organizational value? That's a really good one, because I've often, in working through what outcomes a company's trying to achieve, the first obvious answer is 20% revenue increase or better gross margin, and those are valid things that an organization needs to achieve. But I think it was really important to note that you exist as a business because of customers, and if they don't value what you're delivering, they're not going to give you their money. So being focused on delivering value actually should lead to growth in revenue and growth in margin, it's something you have to keep an eye on, obviously, because you could create lots of value that no one's willing to pay for, or at least seems like lots of value. But that's where your measures kind of come in, don't you think, Luke?
Everything is manipulatable. Everything is open to gaming. And I mean, how many organizations have been in this situation, you know, for whatever pressure coming down, or, you know, fattening up a startup for exit, all sorts of interesting things go on there as well. But, you know, back to that Blockbuster example, if you can dial up your revenues by increasing late fees and increasing customer misery, maybe that's a source of bad money. And maybe you should focus on good money, which is more sustainable. So you can make some choices there, and not always easy choices, because sometimes bad money is easy money, just not sustainable. So make the choices about how well aligned those goals are. And it goes in reverse, that whole sort of 3% tasking. Everybody take 3% out of their budget. Don't care where it comes from. Probably not a great way to approach it either. But looking at it and saying, actually, what's the least customer impact way of reducing our cost base, and doing that really strategically is a different way of going about it.
There's a few more questions here, and I want to answer them all, but we're really kind of low on time. There's one here about digital transformation, and shouldn't we stop talking about transformation and start talking about how human behavior needs to change to actually adopt any degree of change? And I would 100% agree with that. I think people look at transformation as an event, and it can't be an event. Transformation, it's happening every day. You are changing. How intentional are you going to be about that change? And how can you just build that muscle to be able to adapt and change all the time? So I 100% agree with that one. Oh, they're so good, these questions.
And the other one there about existing systems, we're just about to dial up, but taking existing systems, this problem of labeling everything as a platform. Yes, indeed, we are seeing a lot of that. And indeed, even things that are correctly labeled as platforms, there are different flavors of platform businesses versus platforms for business, and so forth. I think one of the ways that you can deal with that, a suggestion, again, back to measurement, back to what levers are associated with this platform. What are the components? How do you measure success within that? Which is a very different thing from simply saying, oh, we get a system that does some stuff. So actually, if you design the machine and lay bare the design of the machine, then it will probably start to look really like a platform, or just like a bunch of check that does some things as part of that process, perhaps.